Welcome! In this series of videos, we will look at software add-ons for the PowerBasic Windows compiler. Today we will look again at the MyLotoGrid custom grid and add additional worksheets or tabs to the existing grid. It has been a couple of months since we looked at this particular project, so a quick recap of what this project actually is probably a good idea. We have on screen a custom grid called MyLotoGrid. This grid is displaying information from a flat text file. The grid is set up to display each column as a certain width and with a particular header. The division column is also selectable by a drop-down list, so you can change the division that a user is in by merely clicking on it. This information is held within the grid. As you can see from the grid, it's showing a single tab or worksheet. What we're going to look at today is adding a second tab to the grid. So let's have a look at the code. If we go into the function that actually displays the dialog on screen, that's a good place to start. In here, we're actually drawing the dialog on the screen. And additionally, we're setting the dimensions of the grid, where it will display on the screen and how large it will be. We have additional functionality built into the grid to allow for a pop-up menu when you right-click on a cell, to allow you to sort the grid either in ascending or descending order, or to copy a cell to the clipboard. We have the column widths set up in a string constant, and the maximum number of columns defined in an integer constant, as are the maximum number of grid rows. We're calling a number of routines within our MLG Lite Utilities library, which patches in to MyLotoGrid. This is designed to make life easier setting up, controlling and maintaining your grids. The rest of the code in here is for setting up the column types and centering and locking things like the ID column. We're also setting up the drop-down list of all the divisions. Once this is all complete, we can then refresh the grid on the screen. The population of the data within the grid is done within the callback function, the event handler. In order to add a second tab or sheet to our grid, we're going to have to put some more code in. So we'll put this in before the grid itself is refreshed. Our first task is to tell the grid that we want to add a new worksheet or tab to the grid. The tab that is currently on the grid is considered to be tab number 1. So the tab we will be adding will be tab number 2. And we'll need to give the tab a name. To add a tab or worksheet to the grid, I've set up a small macro inside the library to make it really easy. The add sheet macro takes a single parameter, which is the handle to our grid. If we ran our code now, we would see a new sheet has automatically appeared and defaulted to the name of sheet number 2. If we actually click on that, MyLotoGrid triggers an event, which will display the grid as it would display to the user. Since we haven't specified any other details of this particular new worksheet, it's holding the headers from the previous one. So next we will set the name of the tab. We're going to call this new tab Summary Data, and there's a function in the library to allow you to rename a tab. This takes the 3 parameters, the grid handle, the tab position, in this case tab number 2, and the tab name. If we ran the code now, we would see that our tab will now come up with this summary data. At this point, we need to consider what we want this new tab to contain. What I'm going to set this one up to be is a summary data tab of the information for departments on the first tab. So we're going to have to change the number of columns, the name of each of the columns, and the number of rows and the data they contain. When you have a MyLotoGrid set up which has more than one tab, most of the functions will either read or write or update the currently selected tab. That's the tab that is currently visible to the user. So we have a small macro to allow us to select a different tab or worksheet. The Select Sheet tab takes 2 parameters, the grid handle and the tab number that we wish to actually use. Most of the MyLotoGrid inbuilt functions have an additional optional parameter, which is the tab number. However, we'll cover that in a later video. Today we're just going to use the Select Sheet macro to select the tab we wish to either read from or write to. Firstly, we will set the names of each of the columns. As we set the column names in a string constant, we'll do exactly the same for the column names on the second tab. We'll call that constant column names summary. This will contain only two columns, the department and the head count. So we can use the set column names function to set the names of our columns on this particular tab. We can use the set column names function to set the names of each of the columns on this second tab, because that's the one we have currently selected. Before we continue with the code, we'll want to set the current tab back to the first tab, so that the code within the callback function will populate the correct tab. So if we run that code now, we will see the demo grid is correctly populated, and the summary data one now has two columns: department, which the column is not quite wide enough to hold it, and the head count. We can widen these columns automatically using an inbuilt function. The widen columns in grid function will widen each column in the grid to be big enough to hold the data it currently contains. At the moment, it only contains a header. So our summary data columns are now wide enough for the data in the header. Now, as we have two columns here, we'll want to adjust the columns to pick up the formatting that we want to be in them. I want the department column to be left justified and coloured blue. And the head count column I want centered into the column, and we want the colour of the font to be red. And both of these are to be locked so that the user cannot update them. So we can use existing functions in our library to actually achieve this. We're going to use the getColumnNumber to pick up the column number of the department column. We know that this department column is column 1, but it's quite useful to use this to determine where the columns are, especially if you have a large number of columns and they may move around. The format column function will take a number of parameters: the grid, the column number, the justification, be it left, right or center, the colour of the foreground of the font, and whether the column is to be locked or unlocked. As there is no data in this second tab, we wouldn't see anything if we ran the code now. So our next task is to actually put the data into the columns. And for that, we'll need to go to the callback function, the event handler. In the initialization section of our callback function is the code that's currently used to populate the first tab. The last piece of code in here is the color bank grid rows that colors alternate rows either white or green. We'll put our new code in here. Since we're going to use this summary tab to contain information that's derived from the first tab, our first task will be to actually extract the information that's currently on the first tab. We can do that with another inbuilt function, the getGridText2Array. We now have to select the second tab or sheet. This will allow us to put information onto that second sheet. So we're using the selectSheet macro again, passing it the grid handle and the sheet number, which in this case is 2. We're going to create a function to populate this summary grid. We'll create that in a moment, but we'll continue with the code in here. So we're passing two pieces of information to the populate summary. We're passing the name of the array, which we will need to declare in a moment, and we're passing the grid handle. The array contains all the information on the first tab or sheet. And then, having populated our second tab, we're going to widen the columns in that particular tab to actually be wide enough to hold the data that's going in. Once that data is in place, we can then colour alternate rows for readability, just as we did with the first tab. If we left the code here, what would be visible to the user is the second tab. This may or may not be what you want in your application. But if we're wanting to move it to another tab, we can then use the selectSheet macro again to set the tab of our choice. In this case, I'm setting the visible tab or sheet back to the first one. Now we will dimension that array at the top of our function, along with the long sheet variable. Now we need to create that populate summary function. This takes the two parameters we had set up, the grid handle, and the array that contains the data that is on the first tab. As we have two columns in here, the first is going to be the department column, and the second is going to be the headcount, the number of staff who are currently active that are actually in that department. So we will have to summarize the information based on the department. For speed here, I am hard coding the column numbers of the data within our array for the department and the active column, as we only want to keep information on the active staff. And we need to know the department column because that contains the name of the department. Now, having got the data in the str data array, we need to read through each row of that, work out whether the employee is active or not, and add to the list of departments. We've got an array set up, str departments, which is currently 20 elements. I'm working on the assumption that the data we have in our first tab does not exceed 20 departments. To be more flexible in your own code, it's best to read through all the data before you determine how many departments there are. So this first part of the code is reading through each record in the str data array, while then checking to see whether the active flag is active or not. In the data returned from MyAutoGrid, if the tick box, which is the active column, is unticked, then it will return a zero-length string. That lets you know that the tick box has not been ticked. If it has been ticked, it will contain either 1 or a CHR$1. So we're merely testing to see whether it's not blank. If it's not blank, the employee must be active. We're then picking up the department from the data array. Then we need to determine, have we actually seen this department already or not? So there's another nested for next loop using a variable called longd. In the departments array, I'm using a pipe delimited list, the first element of which is the department name, and the second element is going to be the head count. So if we do actually find the department we're looking for, then we know it's already been found, and we can increment the value that's currently held in the second element. At that point, we need go no further, and we can use the exit for command to exit from this nested loop. If we find a department count field which is blank, in other words a department that has not been registered yet, then we can record this current department with the value of 1, as this will be the first value going into this entry. Once we get to the end of that for next loop, we will have determined the list of departments. Since this is a single dimension array, it's quite easy to use the array sort command to sort them into descending order. We can do this on one line of code. Next, we want to count just how many departments there are. We set the departments array up to be an array of 20 elements, so we need to count to see how many of them are actually populated. The long count variable will end up being the number of departments. We can then redimension another array for that particular number of values. This will be a multi-dimensional array because we're going to use this to push back into our grid to populate it. So we're stepping through that array using a for next loop. The first element will be the department name, and the second element will be the head count. Now that we've got this far, the only thing we have to do left in this particular function is to populate the array. We can use one of the inbuilt MyAutoGrid functions, mlg_putx. This will allow us to take a complete array and push it directly into the grid. We have a couple of options here, one for refreshing to refresh the grid straight away, and the option variable is to allow us, in this case, not to write over column headers because we have already set them up. So if we try running our code now, we will see the first tab is correctly populated. If we look at the second tab now, we'll see the second tab has a list of the departments in descending alphabetical order. The department column has all the text in blue and is left justified. The second column is the head count. It has the data centered in the column and the text is in red. So to summarize, what we've done today is we have taken our demo grid, which has been populated with the text file. We have created a second tab on our grid, and we have summarized the information from the first tab onto the summary data tab. As you can probably guess, there is an event being triggered each time a user clicks on the tab handle. This can be picked up to work out which tab the user is currently on. However, we'll cover that in the next video. That's it for today. Thank you for watching.